Now is 7 minutes after the hour.
A lovely shot of Westminster Abbey. The Germans actually signed their surrender agreement 40 years ago yesterday and not 40 years ago today. So you might wonder why VE Day anniversary is being observed now. The answer is that the announcement of the surrender was delayed for a day as a favor to the Russians, who were our allies during World War II. But news of the surrender leaked out here and in the United States through an American press report, and the VE celebrations began early. Well, Steve Baskerville has been doing a little bit of research on his own about VE Day weather. Members of the royal family have been taking part in a special service of Thanksgiving, memorial, and reconciliation. Prime Minister Thatcher and other government leaders also were there, along with representatives of the armed services and of Britain's major religious groups. Bill, what's going on there in Germany today?
Well, there is not much going on in West Berlin, Phyllis, because in West Berlin, it's not a big holiday. It is simply a day to remember. But in East Berlin, just on the other side of that wall, it is a very big holiday. 100,000 East Germans, along with their leaders and Soviet dignitaries, commemorated the end of the Great Patriotic War, as they call it, at Treptow Cemetery. In the East, it's a national holiday with a distinctly Russian point of view. The Soviets are represented as winning the war single-handedly, as well as liberating Berlin. That is a view not held in the West. Allied leaders were invited to attend, but they declined in the East. But just on the other side of the wall, another ceremony at a Soviet monument still guarded by the Russians was taking place, and Allied representatives did attend. The Soviet War Memorial, just a toehold inside West Berlin, and still Russian territory. Celebrations differ all across Europe, of course. We'll show you some more ceremonies that will be taking place a little later today in East Berlin, and we will be there tomorrow. Walter Cronkite is standing by at the War Cabinet Room in London, and that is also a celebration of a very different sort. Good morning, Walter.
Good morning, Bill. Well, as you know, for the citizens of Paris, VE Day was somewhat anticlimactic, not like the people under the besieged Berlin's fiery walls there. You'll recall that the French capital had been liberated almost a year, 9 months before VE Day, but still there was plenty of room for celebrating today and then. In Paris today, French President Francois Mitterrand placed a wreath beneath the Arc de Triomphe to honor France's war dead. The French president also awarded medals to some heroes of the Second World War. There they are. Among them were members of the French resistance. The resistance, of course, was very powerful in helping to win the war. Many of these people risked their lives to bring an end to the Nazi occupation of France. Well, a victory in Europe wasn't exactly planned in this room where I am, Bill. At least it was assured by preserving the safety of Winston Churchill and his cabinet during the Blitz of summer of 1940 and on into the winter of 1941. Underneath a government building about 500 yards from the the premier's residence at 10 Downing Street, they built this war room where he could help defend Britain against the invasion they feared would come and to be protected against the falling bombs and artillery shells. The representatives of the Navy and the Air Force and the Army and the Home Guard all sat around the table. They all had telephones to their headquarters. The color of the telephone doesn't mean anything. As usual, it was planned that they would mean something, but then they didn't have the right colors anyway, so they just forgot the whole thing. There is a telephone up there for the representative of General Headquarters. He was the commander of this room. He could get right through to the headquarters command at any time for the Prime Minister if he needed to from this room. This is rather interesting. This is the map of the world showing the disposition during the war of all of the forces of the world, enemy and friendly. And most interesting, I think, are these things that must look to you on the television kind of like lines across the Atlantic and down through the Mediterranean and so forth. Well, actually, they're not lines at all. They're thousands of tiny pinholes. Each one of those had represented a convoy, many of them fighting for their lives out there in the Atlantic during those dark days, and tragically, many of those pins had to be removed as convoys were destroyed. Well, we'll be back here in a moment.
It's now 15 minutes after the hour.
Shelter below Whitehall in London. There's a room so very closely identified with Winston Churchill that we thought it was just the place to chat with a couple of his descendants. Lady Soames is the youngest child of the Churchills, the only surviving of their 5 children. And his grandson not only carries that great name, Winston Churchill, but as a member of Parliament and as a world-traveling foreign correspondent and journalist, he carries on the Winston Churchill tradition. I spoke with them earlier in the day. Lady Soames, I gather that you actually spent more time down here sleeping than the Prime Minister did, your father.
I'm quite sure I did, because my father spent very few nights down here at all. But in the first floor apartment that was made for my parents when Downing Street was considered unsafe, there was no room for their soldier daughter when she came home on leave. So when I came on leave, I had to come down here to sleep.
It's kind of interesting that you were coming on leave from your anti-aircraft battery that you commanded and had to find shelter down here.
Yes, I didn't command it. I was a member of it.
Why didn't he use the room more? It seemed to be a very comfortable
Well,
bedroom.
this whole complex down here was, if in the event of push coming to a real shove, it was the last redoubt situation. But they were very well accommodated for living up aloft. And of course, whenever my father possibly could, he preferred to use the cabinet room, the proper cabinet room in Downing Street. Business as usual.
I gather they had about 1/10 of the cabinet meetings during the wartime years actually here. But of course, most of those were during the actual Blitz, when this was a haven.
Yes, it was indeed, and would have meant all the difference to survival.
I gather that you have a memory, you were telling me a moment ago, of almost a prenatal memory of having taken shelter elsewhere from here.
Well, my mother, who's now married to Averil Harriman, she relates how in the summer of 40, I suppose it must have been about June, mid-June, about a month after my grandfather became Prime Minister, when we were expecting the German invasion at any minute.
And she was expecting your birth.
Sea Lion, and she was expecting my birth within 2 or 3 months. That when the air raids got heavy, she was sent below to sleep. And there was this tiny room, much smaller than the one we're in here. This was before this was constructed. This was a purpose-built bunker, as it were, in the cellars under number 10 itself. And there was a double-deck bed with a narrow, rickety stepladder. And she would go to sleep on the lower bunk. And occasionally, about 2 or 3 in the morning, my grandfather would arrive and would climb up the rickety stepladder and would snore the sleep of the just for 3 or 4 hours until the all clear went, and then he would hightail it back to his own room about 5 or 6 in the morning.
I understand that Alan Brooke, was running the war effort at that moment, wanted very much to, or defied, in a way, the Prime Minister's desire to make a real war room out of this area here. He wanted it elsewhere, didn't think there's enough room here and all that. But your father was a pretty dogged man about that sort of thing. Did you ever hear of any discussion about whether this was a practical operation or not?
No, I never heard that. This was it was used for a number of purposes. My father broadcast quite a lot from here. There were cabinet meetings here, and of course the map rooms were here, upon which my father relied enormously for his instant appreciation of what was going on any war front.
But Walter, I think Mary's right in saying that, in fact, he lived down here a very small part of the time, and when the action really got exciting, the Prime Minister was as likely to be found on the roof of Number 10 or the Air Ministry watching the bombers as they came over London, dropping their loads, as he was to be found down here below deck.
There are no smoking signs all through this area, and yet we know that your father was wont to have a cigar quite frequently. Did you ever see any complications because of that conflict of rules?
I never saw it.
Well, thank you very, very much for being with us this morning. Actually, of course, they waived that rule for the Prime Minister. You saw his humidor there and his ashtrays, and there are plenty of them around here, but there were some areas where there was no smoking. Lady Soames told us of VE Day, too, when her father was so disappointed, and her mother was very disappointed because they couldn't be together on that great day. Mrs. Churchill, Clementine, was in Moscow, of all places. She'd gone there on a goodwill visit. She had raised a lot of money for Russian relief, and she was caught in Moscow instead of in London for the big celebration on VE Day. Well, not long after our conversation this morning, Lady Soames and Winston Churchill traveled to Westminster Abbey to attend today's services in commemoration of this great day. And Phyllis George, of course, is just in front of Westminster Abbey.
Thank you, Walter. Queen Elizabeth and other members of the royal family have been leading the British nation in a special VE Day celebrations commemoration service. It's been taking place in Westminster Abbey right across from us. It's a very appropriate place because in Westminster Abbey is the grave of Britain's unknown warrior, and he's being honored today with a candlelight ceremony.
Here they call it the 0 hour, which marks the lowest point in the history of the German people. This day 40 years ago, no German city took a worse beating in the war than Berlin. In a way, it was miraculous that the Brandenburg Gate still stands behind me when the city all around it was reduced to dust. It rises there 8 stories high, a reminder of the glory days when Germany won its wars. During this half hour, we're going to be looking back at some of those days just before Adolf Hitler killed himself in the bunker and the Russians took Berlin. And we'll do it with William Shirer, who wrote The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, who is reporting for CBS News.
The audience that he chose for this VE Day speech, it was the European Parliament, which is the legislative branch, really, of the economic community, the common market of Europe. It is thought by many to be Europe's best hope for a unified government someday. The people who belong to that parliament are elected independently in their countries, and there's a very large leftist, socialist, and even some communist representation there, and some of them walked out during parts of the president's speech today, including that part in which he talked about Nicaragua. They don't like the American policy there particularly. But it was a very interesting speech, and our correspondent, Terrence Smith, is right there in the town square at Strasbourg, which, as all of you know, I assume, is in Alsace, right on the border between France and Germany, been fought over many times through the centuries, and they're both French and Germans in the audience. How did they react, Terry, to the speech?
Well, Walter, here in the square, several thousand people listening to the speech on a loudspeaker responded most enthusiastically when he talked about European unity, the American commitment to European unity, and to preserving it. They followed, I think, all the general lines of response that you saw in the Parliament building, basically quite positive. Right now, they seem riveted by the music of Lionel Richie, sung by Joan Faulkner. But they did have a basically positive response to the speech.
Were they as attentive to President Reagan as to Joan Faulkner?
That's right. I think it's a tough competition for him. But as he made the point himself, it was one of the longer speeches of the century, in his words. And he outlined a whole series of points, I think, building up to his central theme, that he wants to reduce tensions with the Soviet Union and wants Europe to, in effect, join the United States in that effort in both practical moves and larger strategic moves, such as his own Strategic Defense Initiative, or Star Wars, as it's known.
Terry, I'm a little puzzled about it. It seems to me that it was a deliberately restrained speech on the president's part to this particular audience, one in which he did seem to be seeking accommodation with the Soviet Union, even friendship with the Soviet Union. At one point, you could interpret it that way. But at the same time, his national security advisor, Robert McFarlane, in briefing reporters yesterday, I guess it was, wasn't it? He seemed to emphasize, make a particular point, and go into much greater detail than the president did. The president spent one paragraph talking about the dangers of a new Soviet missile, the SSX-24, which we knew about before, has been mentioned before, but never so much emphasis, I don't think, on it. Now, Terry, do you have any idea why this sort of dichotomy, this difference in approach by the president toward accommodation in this European speech, but McFarlane briefing American reporters on the dangers of a new Soviet missile?
Well, I think there are two things here, Walter. There is the good cop, bad cop routine, in effect, of the president drawing out the broad themes, his advisors stressing those tougher elements in the speech. It was certainly there. I think its real purpose is to build a platform or a rationale for the Strategic Defense Initiative, because he leads from the Soviet development of this missile to support for his Star Wars concept. Another point worth recalling is that this missile is not yet deployed, will not be deployed until 1986, and will not be mobile, as the president said, until 1988 or 89. So in that sense, we're talking about a future threat.
Larry, thank you very much for that report from Alsace, from Strasbourg, the president's speech. Just one footnote on it. The president did have people walk out, and at one point, I must say, his big smile began as soon as they started walking out, so I wonder if this is really an ad lib or he had been prepared in his mind as to what he was going to say, but he had a good line. He said, you know, I think I've learned something useful today. Maybe if I talk as long as this before our Congress, some of them will walk out too. The president, not a bad one. He's pretty good with a quick one. Okay, thank you very much again, Terry. And now back to you, Phyllis, in front of Westminster Abbey.
Thank you, Walter and Terry. Author-journalist William L. Shirer is the man who literally wrote the book on World War II. In a moment, we'll travel to West Berlin, where Bill Kurtis interviews the author of The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. Just ahead. Stay with us.
It's now 16 minutes before the hour.
Thus will end the war between Germany and Italy on the one hand and France on the other.
William Shirer was a radio correspondent in Berlin during the 30s and 40s. He witnessed and reported on the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis, and later wrote about it in The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. We brought him back to Berlin to talk about those nightmare years. Now, Hitler's chancellor is gone. That was destroyed during the war, wasn't it?
It's gone. It was on the corner as you look down there of the Wilhelmstrasse. It was the last building on the Wilhelmstrasse. But from here you can see what was the garden of the Chancellery. You see that green spot just beyond that fence?
Yes.
When you look beyond the gate? That was the garden of the Chancellery, where, of course, underneath it was the bunker where Hitler met his last days.
Think back to those nightmare years, if you will. The late 30s, the rise of the Nazi Party and Hitler. What was the mood like here, the atmosphere, especially in that area?
Hitler was a very popular man, and my feeling, at least, was that the bulk of the people supported him. And we often used to ask ourselves, how is it possible? Hitler was giving the German people a great deal of what they wanted, and what maybe a lot of people would have wanted any place. He was wiping out the shame of the defeat in 1918, and all Germans welcomed that. He was tearing down the Versailles Treaty, which all Germans hated. He was wiping out unemployment. He was giving them a certain prosperity. So there were those things which, with any people, are attractive, but the other aspects were more difficult to comprehend.
Tell me about those speeches. What was it about Hitler that could captivate this nation so?
In oratory, he was a genius. You have to admit it. He had this tremendous way of connecting with the German people through speech. He also worked to perfect the use of radio, which very few people did at that time, and the loudspeaker. There was a field in Nuremberg where they held the party congresses in which they would crowd 500,000 people, usually at night, torchlights, arc lights going up, the pageantry, and Hitler would address them. Now, you know, when you address 500,000 people, you have to speak slowly and distinctly and so forth, but also with emotion. And sometimes the emotion of 500,000 people, even to us correspondents, was almost frightening. And Hitler said on one occasion, he happened to be talking off the cuff to someone, he said, those 500,000 people go home and they spread the word to another 1 million or 2 million people. And he said, I've made a lot of converts. So it was important. And for most of the time we joked about Hitler and unfortunately refused to come to grips with the fact that he was a very able guy. Evil, but able.
Looking out now at the wall, the Brandenburg Gate, what do you feel when you realize this once was the center of power here in Germany in all those years and now split almost in half?
Well, I think one of the things that depresses me most particularly in this visit is that wall down there that you can see. No longer can you walk through the Brandenburger Gate as I've done 1,000,000 times. And you see that little tower down there?
Yes.
Looks like a prison. And to me, it's been a depressing experience to come back in 1985.
Bill Shirer and I have now come to this position in front of the Brandenburg Gate. It was an exciting time for a reporter back then. What do you think of Berlin now?
Well, the contrast is tremendous. Back in that Nazi time, even though it was not a pleasant place to work, there was a great deal of news, a great deal of bustling. And this street that we're standing on in front of the Brandenburger Tor was full of traffic, cars moving, people going through. And I can't quite believe it. I looked back there now, there's nothing doing. Through this gate came the great parades and a great deal of excitement. Now it's different. And I noticed today, celebrating VE Day, it's not a very big day here in Berlin. I noticed a paper here. Would you believe it, the top story in the Berliner Morgen Post is the First Lady, Nancy Reagan, dancing the flamenco. And beneath it is a little story saying, Remembrance on the day the war ended, we're ready for reconciliation.
Now, so many people don't know whether to celebrate because
I found that talking today to some Germans and also reading the press carefully, there are two kinds. One group that says this day was a day of our defeat, and you must understand we don't like to celebrate it. The others say it was our defeat, but it was a liberation from Hitler, liberation from the bombing, and we're going to celebrate it.
Russians lost 100,000 men taking Berlin, and tomorrow we're going to go to East Berlin.